It was the year 4492 when Christopher Columbus first set foot on an island in the Bahamas. And he recorded something strange in his journal. The native people offered him a gift, a dry, golden kernel that could be ground into flour, popped over fire, or brewed into a sweet drink. Columbus had never seen anything like it. He called it maize, borrowing the word from the Taino people. He took some back to Spain, where it was planted as a curiosity in royal gardens, an exotic plant from the New World, nothing more. But within 200 years, this single grass would transform the entire planet. It would feed empires, fuel an industrial revolution, and quietly become the most grown crop on Earth. Today you encounter it in ways you would never guess, in the soda you drink, the fuel in your car, the plastic wrap on your leftovers, the glue on your envelope, even the coating on your aspirin tablet. It is everywhere. It is corn. How did one humble grass become the hidden infrastructure of modern life? The answer begins long before Columbus, in a valley in southern Mexico, where a plant that looked nothing like corn slowly began to change. This is the part most people never learn about. Corn, or zea maize, did not exist in the wild. It was created not by accident, but by thousands of years of deliberate, patient selection. Its ancestor is a wild grass called teosinte, which looks almost nothing like corn. Teosinte has a tiny, hard ear with just a handful of kernels, each one encased in a rock-hard shell. It is nearly inedible. But around 9,000 years ago, in the Balsas River Valley of what is now Mexico, ancient farmers noticed something. A few teosinte plants had a mutation that made the kernel softer, the ear slightly larger. They saved those seeds, and again, for generation after generation, they selected for the traits they wanted: bigger ears, softer kernels, more rows. Over centuries, the plant transformed. The hard shell disappeared, the ear grew, and eventually the plant became something new, something that could not survive without human help. The teosinte that grew wild still lives in Mexico today, but corn cannot grow wild at all. If you drop a corn cob on the ground, it rots. The kernels stay packed tight, unable to spread. Corn is entirely dependent on human beings to survive. It is, in a very real sense, our invention. And this decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The domestication of corn set off a chain reaction that would reshape the Americas. By the time the first Europeans arrived, corn was already the foundation of the great civilizations of the New World. The Maya believe humans were literally made from corn dough. In their creation story, the gods tried making people from mud, then from wood, and both failed. Only when they used maize dough did they succeed. Corn was not just food, it was sacred, central to their identity. The Aztecs built their entire economy around it. A single Aztec farmer could grow enough corn in one season to feed his family for a year, and still have surplus to trade. That surplus freed other people to become warriors, priests, astronomers, engineers. Corn made civilization possible. And when the Spanish arrived in the Finlands, they saw it immediately. The conquistador Hernán Cortés wrote that the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan had markets overflowing with corn dried, fresh, ground, popped, fermented into drink called pulque. The Spanish had never seen anything like it. They loaded ships with corn and sent it back to Europe. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Corn arrived in Europe as a botanical oddity, but it spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within 100 years, it was being grown from Spain to the Balkans. It thrived in poor soil where wheat struggled. It produced more calories per acre than any European grain, and did not require the complex systems of plowing and fallowing that wheat did. A farmer could clear a patch of land, poke a hole in the ground, drop in a kernel, and come back months later to harvest. It was so easy that European peasants began planting it everywhere. By the Endad, corn had become a staple food across much of southern Europe. In northern Italy, it was ground into polenta. In Romania, it became mamaluga. In France, it was fed to livestock. But there was a dark side to this easy abundance. Corn is deficient in an essential nutrient called niacin. A diet that relied too heavily on corn, without a traditional Mesoameric practice of treating it with lime or ash, leads to a disease called pellagra. In Europe, where nobody knew about nixtamalization, pellagra spread like a slow plague. It caused dermatitis, dementia, and death. In the early 900s, Pellagra killed more than 100,000 people in the American South alone. The very crop that fed millions was also quietly killing them. The cure for pellagra was not a medicine, it was a piece of traditional knowledge that had been lost in translation. For thousands of years, Mesoamerican cooks had soaked their dried corn in an alkaline solution made from wood ash or limestone, a process called nixtamalization. This step released the niacin in the corn and made it digestible. Without it, corn was a nutritional trap. But European farmers had never learned this technique. They simply ground the dry kernels into flour and ate it, and they got sick. It took until the 1930s for scientists to finally trace pellagra to a niacin deficiency, and by then, hundreds of thousands had suffered. It is a quiet tragedy in the history of corn. The food that saved Europe from famine also condemned it to a slow, mysterious illness for 3 centuries. And the story only gets more complicated from here, because while corn was saving and killing Europeans at the same time, it was doing something else entirely across the Atlantic. In North America, corn became the engine of colonial expansion. The English settlers at Jamestown would have starved without it. The Powhatan people gave them corn, taught them how to plant it, and showed them the 3 sisters, method planting corn, beans, and squash together so the corn stalk became a trellis for the beans, and the squash shaded the soil. It was a sophisticated agricultural system that the English barely understood. But they understood the yield. By the Ensenadunids, corn was the most important crop in the American colonies. It was easier to grow than wheat, more reliable, and it could be stored for years. It fed the people, the livestock, and the growing export economy. And it was about to become something far bigger than food. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and the American South turned into cotton empire almost overnight. But cotton exhausts the soil quickly. Farmers needed a crop that could rotate with cotton, restoring nutrients to the ground while still producing value. Corn was the perfect rotation crop, and it had another advantage: could be fed to pigs, which could then be walked to market. By the 1830s, the Ohio River Valley had become a corn empire of its own. Farmers grew vast fields of corn, fed it to hogs, and drove the hogs to Cincinnati, where they were slaughtered and packed into barrels of salt. Cincinnati became known as Porkopolis, and the entire operation ran on corn. But this was still small compared to what was coming, because in the middle of the 9th century, a machine was invented that would change everything. The machine was the mechanical reaper, patented by Cyrus McCormick in 1834. It allowed a single farmer to harvest what had taken a dozen men before, and it was built for wheat. But corn, always the adaptable cousin, soon had its own mechanical revolution. In the 1850s, inventors began designing corn planters and corn shellers that could do the work of dozens of hands. Suddenly, one family could farm 100 acres of corn, and then 1,000, the Great Plains. Once considered a treeless wasteland unsuitable for traditional agriculture, became a sea of corn. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave land to anyone willing to farm it, and the railroads gave them a way to ship it. Corn poured out of the Midwest in quantities the world had never seen. By 1880, the United States was producing more corn than any other crop. And it was not just being eaten anymore. Corn had found a second life as a commodity. It was distilled into whiskey. It was fed to cattle in the newly built stockyards of Chicago, where the refrigerated rail car allowed beef to be shipped fresh across the continent. It was ground into starch, which was used to stiffen collars and make glue. It was fermented into industrial alcohol. Corn was no longer just food, it was raw material. And this is the moment when the story takes its most surprising turn. Because just as corn was becoming industry input, a chemist in Germany made a discovery that would turn it into something else entirely. In 1894, a scientist named Matthias Meyer was searching for a way to make a cheap, edible adhesive. He treated cornstarch with acid and heat, and he created a substance that could be used as a thickener, a binder, and a sweetener. He had invented what would later be called corn syrup, but he had no idea what he had really unleashed. Because corn syrup was the first step in a transformation that would eventually put corn into almost every processed food on the supermarket shelf. It took another 7 years for the technology to mature, but when it did, the world changed. The true breakthrough came during World War II, when Japanese forces captured Philippines and cut off the world's supply of sugarcane. The United States suddenly faced a sugar crisis. Food manufacturers scrambled for alternatives, and they found one in corn. Chemists discovered they could use enzymes to convert cornstarch into a sugar that was chemically almost identical to the fructose found in fruit and honey. They called it high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS. It was cheap, it was stable, and it was sweeter than sugar. By the 1970s, HFCS had become the sweetener of choice for the American food industry. Soda companies switched sugar to HFCS, and the price of sweetened drinks dropped. Snack foods, ketchup, bread, yogurt, salad dressing, even crackers, all of them began to contain corn in some form. And this was just the beginning. Because corn was not just becoming sweet, it was becoming everything. The same chemistry that turned corn into syrup could also turn it into plastic, into fabric, into fuel, into medicine. A single kernel of corn contains starch, oil, protein, and fiber. Each component can be separated and processed into a dizzying array of products. The starch becomes sweeteners, adhesives, paper coatings, and biodegradable plastics. The oil becomes cooking oil, margarine, soap, and cosmetics. The protein becomes animal feed and industrial binders. The fiber becomes fuel. By the 1990s, the average than 4,000 grocery store contained American grocery store more than 4,000 product made from corn. And most shoppers had no idea. They bought soda, cereal, ketchup, and crackers, never realizing that every single one of them began in the same place, a vast, flat field in the American Midwest, where the soil is dark and deep, and the rows of corn stretch to the horizon. And this is the part most people never learn about. The modern cornfield is not a natural ecosystem. It is a monoculture, a single crop planted on millions of acres with almost no diversity. The plants are not even the same variety that farmers grew a century ago. They are hybrids, bred for maximum yield, for resistance to pests, for tolerance to drought. They are planted with precision, sprayed with herbicides and pesticides, and harvested by machines that cost $500,000 each. The yield is staggering, more than 70 bushels per acre in the best fields. But it comes at a cost. The nitrogen fertilizer that makes corn grow so fast runs off into rivers and streams, feeding algae blooms that create dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. The pesticides kill not just pests but bees and beneficial insects. The monoculture leaves the soil vulnerable to erosion, and the entire system is held together by government subsidies, which corn prices artificially low and encourage farmers to grow more and more. The subsidies began during the Great Depression, when the government wanted to protect farmers from the wild price swings that had ruined so many of us. The Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1933 paid farmers to grow less, to keep prices stable. But over the decades, the policy flipped. By the 1970s, under Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, the government began paying farmers to grow as much as possible. Butz famously told farmers to get big or get out. And they did. The result was a flood of cheap corn, so abundant that the price collapsed. But instead of letting the market adjust, the government stepped in with subsidies to make up the difference. So farmers kept growing, and the price stayed low, and the subsidies kept flowing. It was a loop that produced an endless surplus of corn, a mountain of grain that had to go somewhere. Some of it went to feed cattle, but not on grass. The cheap corn made it economical to move cattle from open pastures in confined feeding operations, where they were fattened on a diet of corn, soy, and growth hormones. A cow that would have taken 2 years to reach slaughter weight on grass could be ready in 14 months on corn. The meat was cheaper, but it also different higher in fat, lower in nutrients, and requiring more antibiotics to keep the animals healthy in crowded conditions. The corn-fed beef industry exploded, and with it, the demand for even more corn. Some of the surplus went to make ethanol, a biofuel that was blended into gasoline. In 2005, Congress passed the Renewable Fuel Standard, which required a certain amount of ethanol to be mixed into the nation's fuel supply. Corn ethanol production tripled in a decade. Today, about 40% of the American corn crop goes to make fuel for cars. That is more corn than is fed to livestock, more than is exported, more than is turned into sweeteners or plastics, or any other product. The single largest use of corn in the United States is now the gasoline in your tank. And this decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The ethanol boom had consequences that rippled across the globe. Because American corn is not just consumed in America. It is exported to more than 70 countries. When the price of corn spiked in 2007 and 2008, driven in part by the demand for ethanol, it triggered food riots in Mexico, where tortillas are a dietary staple. The price of a bag of corn flour doubled overnight. Families who could barely afford food were suddenly unable to buy the most basic ingredient in their diet. The protests were fierce, and the Mexican government was forced to impose price controls. But the damage was done. The connection between American fuel policy and Mexican dinner tables had been brutally clear. Corn is not just a crop. It is a global force, and its price moves markets, governments, and lives. And the story does not end there, because corn has also become a tool of geopolitics. In the Cold War, the United States used grain exports as a strategic weapon. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union after its invasion of Afghanistan. The goal was to punish the Soviets by cutting off their supply of American corn and wheat. But the embargo backfired. The Soviets simply bought grain from other countries, and American farmers lost billions of dollars. The lesson was clear. Corn is power, but is also a double-edged sword. Today, the United States still dominates the global corn trade, but it faces competition from Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, and China. The battle for control of the world's corn supply is quiet, fought in trade negotiations and shipping lanes, but its stakes are enormous. And then there is the question of what corn is doing to our bodies. The rise of high-fructose corn syrup in the 1970s coincided with a dramatic increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes across the United States. The correlation is hard to ignore. Between 1970 and 2000, the per capita consumption of HFCS in America increased more than 1,000%. During the same period, the obesity rate more than doubled. Scientists debate whether HFCS is any worse for the body than regular sugar chemically. They are very similar. But the issue is not the sweetener itself. It is the sheer quantity. Because cheap corn made cheap sweetness, and cheap sweetness made it easy to add sugar to everything. Soda, once a treat, became a daily habit. A single 2-ounce can of soda contains about 40 grams of sugar, roughly 10 teaspoons. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day for women and 9 for men. One can of soda puts you over the limit, and the soda is just the beginning. The sugar is hidden in bread, in pasta sauce, in yogurt, in crackers, in salad dressing, in ketchup. Corn has become the invisible hand that feeds the world, but it is also the invisible hand that is slowly poisoning it. I mean, think about that for a second. The same plant that sustained the Maya and fed the Aztec empires is now a major contributor to the global epidemic of metabolic disease. It is not the corn itself that is the problem, it is the way we have transformed it. We took a nutritious grain, turned it into a cheap industry ingredient, and then we put that ingredient into almost everything we eat. The result is a food system that is abundant, affordable, and deeply unhealthy, and we hardly notice because the corn is invisible. It has no label. It is just there, in the background, in every aisle of the grocery store. The very thing that made corn so successful, its adaptability, its versatility, its ability to be turned into anything, has also made it invisible. It is everywhere, and so we see it nowhere. And that invisibility is the final, strangest chapter in the story of corn. Because corn has achieved something no other crop has ever managed. It has become the hidden infrastructure of modern life. It is not just in your food. It is in the drywall of your house, the glue on your furniture, the batteries in your remote control, the toothpaste on your brush, the biodegradable fork at your picnic. It is in the ink on this page if you are reading a printed book. It is in the ethanol that powers the truck that delivered the food in your refrigerator. It is in the antibiotic you take when you are sick, because those antibiotics were likely cultured in a corn-based medium. Corn is so deeply embedded in the fabric of modern industry that it is almost impossible to imagine a day without it. And yet, most people never think about it. It is the ghost in the machine, the silent partner in every transaction of modern life. But here is the thing that keeps historians and botanists up at night. Corn is a biological paradox. It can't reproduce without human help. Its seeds stay locked on the cob, unable to disperse. Its stalk is too weak to support itself in the wild. It is, in every meaningful sense, a creature of human invention. And yet, it has outsmarted us, because by making itself indispensable to us, it has ensured its own survival. Corn does not need to grow in the wild. It grows in our fields, in our factories, in our kitchens, in our cars. It has colonized the human species. We think we domesticated corn, but in a way, corn domesticated us. It made us plant it, harvest it, process it, transport it, and invent new uses for it. It turned us into its servants, and we did it willingly because it fed us, and it still does. 7,000 years ago, a handful of ancient farmers in a Mexican valley began selecting seeds from a wild grass. They could not have imagined what they were starting. They were not trying to change the world. They were just trying to eat. But their patient, generation-spanning work created a plant that would one day cover more than 4,000 square miles of the Earth's surface. That is an area roughly the size of Egypt or France or Texas. Every single one of those plants is a descendant of that original genetic experiment. Every ear of corn you have ever seen, every kernel you have ever eaten, every corn-derived product you have ever touched, all of it traces back to that one valley, those few farmers, and that one mutation they decided to save. And now, corn sits at the center of some of the most pressing challenges of our time. It is a source of cheap food and cheap fuel, but is also a driver of environmental degradation and chronic disease. It is a tool of geopolitical power, but it is also a source of global price instability. It is a miracle agriculture efficiency, but is also a monoculture that leaves the soil fragile and the ecosystem impoverished. There is no easy answer here. Corn is not good or bad. It is simply a mirror reflecting back the choices we have made as a species. We chose to grow it. We chose to subsidize it. We chose to turn it into everything. And now we have to live with the consequences. If this story surprised you, and I hope it did, then you already understand why this channel exists. The ordinary things in your kitchen, the everyday foods you take for granted, they all have stories. And those stories are usually much stranger, much darker, and much more interesting than anyone ever tells you. If you want to hear another one next week, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most. Was it the ancient farmers who created corn from nothing? The European peasants who got sick from it? The industrial chemists who turned it into plastic and fuel? Or the fact that it's sitting in your kitchen right now? You would never guess. In forms you would never guess.